welcome to the MessianTic podcast, a podcast about all things Messianic Judaism. Each episode we will be sharing our opinions as we tackle some of the biggest issues in Messianic Judaism. Now here's your hosts, Rabbis Eric, David, Jonathan, and Toby.
Hey everyone, welcome to MessianTics today. Today we're going to be engaging with a discussion on a topic about how to not diminish believers in the Christian church without compromising our convictions and what we hold to be true within Messianic Judaism, specifically as it pertains to the Torah and to the Jewishness of the New Testament and the apostles and everything that they taught and handed down starting in the first century. So we have this interesting dynamic, as Rabbi Eric was saying just a minute ago, that and not everyone is like this, but we do have, there is there tends to be kind of a to use the language of my generation, a vibe. There's an energy of well, this thing is for Jewish people. This thing is for Jewish believers in Yeshua. And by the way, the church is terrible and has everything wrong. There's nothing right with it, and there's no truth to be found. Blah 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 blah. However, if you're Gentile, that's good for you. You should be there in the church. You should be with the Christians because this is for Jewish people. By the way, we have all the truth and all knowledge and all understanding. And if you want any of that, I'm sorry, you can't have what we have. And so there's this idea that, while we want to preach the truth and bring people to Messiah, we also kind of talk out of both sides of our mouths sometimes. Sort of like, well, we're true. However, you need to go to that place that's not true, when we know that's not necessarily the case. Because there's a lot of things that Christianity gets wrong. There's a lot of things that churches have gotten wrong for years, decades, centuries. However, there's a lot of things we get wrong as well, and I'm sure we'll be corrected on many things when Messiah returns. But how do we reconcile that relationship dynamic within not only our own congregations, but within the Messianic movement as a whole?
And I guess part of the question is, how do we deal with the differences without being judgmental in a unrighteous way? Or, in other words, we look at things within Messianic Judaism, for instance, the feasts, the holy days, Pesach, Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, Shavuot, Sukkot, and we believe they're vital, important, that they're eternal, that God gave them to His people to observe every year, and yet the church does not, as a whole, participate in those things. So we believe that we're right about the importance of the festivals, of the feast days, and especially in Messianic Judaism, in the majority of it at least, we believe that they're participatory for non-Jews and Jews.
Right.
So if you come to our congregation on one of the feast days, if we're having a Passover Seder meal, we don't say, okay, this meal is only for the Jews. You Gentiles go eat your ham sandwiches or your Easter ham and come back next week.
Right.
We don't do that. Yet we also know that the greater body which believes in Yeshua, which we, at least at this table, believe have a relationship with Messiah, even if they have not, if they don't hold all truth, because likewise we don't hold all truth. They don't do that, and so there is a schism in understanding and belief and observance in participation, while there still has to be a unity in Messiah.
Right.
And how do we navigate that in a way that is not hateful or overly judgmental? And first, I want to say, I believe we're supposed to judge, but I don't think we're supposed to be adversarial or hateful in what we're doing. It should be judgment to instruct, judgment in order to lead, judgment in order to teach, judgment in order to share.
Right.
Because if, for instance, somebody is caught in adultery. There's nothing wrong with saying adultery is ungodly, you need to repent.
Right.
So we're supposed to judge things like that. But somehow we have to be able to look at not just those within the Messianic movement, but those within the greater body of Messiah as part of who we are, while at the same time not diminishing the importance of those things that God has shared.
Right.
With the Messianic movement that I believe are and should be expanded through and to all believers.
Yeah, I think the point is to judge well. If you're going to judge the right way. I think the place we should probably start with is the understanding that people who are truly following Messiah, Christians who are born again and following after what they understand and what they have, the truth that they do have. God bless them for what they follow, that they follow what they do understand and have. Because realistically, if you read about Christians throughout history, like they are noted by all societies around them as people who do follow most of the Torah. When Yeshua comes and is teaching on the Torah, the sermon on what we call, what's commonly called Sermon on the Mount, the higher, what he calls the weightier matters of the law, that of faith and justice and mercy. Christianity is known for those things. Like, it is known when it came into areas that had never heard of Messiah, had never heard of the Torah, never heard of the Bible. Like, immediately, that's what Christians are known for. They're known for their attentiveness to the sick and the needy, the old, the dying, those who whose society is, for centuries, were willing to just cast off and let die. They were more than willing to let the elderly and sick and feeble go the way of the world. But it was the Christians who came in and said, no, I'm going to at least make sure you're comfortable and warm and fed, even though you may be actively dying. Giving to the poor and the needy, those who don't have, having compassion on those who, a lot of society would not necessarily have compassion on. Maybe they did something wrong. It was the Christians who you find forgiving, and being charitable towards those people that are ostracized and castaways, cast-offs of society. So, reading about them through history, and about what the other nations, pagan religions and all these groups that they come in and kind of take over, what they thought about Christians, that's who they are. And so realistically, when we talk about Christians aren't doing the same things we're doing, we're only talking about really a handful of things. Like, we're talking about Sabbaths, which include feasts and festivals. So observe days. Things like kashrut and kosher. And really, those are the two big things, like, really. And because, again, I'm kind of lumping in Sabbaths, plural, the weekly Shabbat along with the annual Sabbaths. So, but they do all the other things that we're called to do. Like, they're the moral, people of God that they're called and expected to be. It's just the other things, the very things that are very Jewish, that through some rather,
or at least have become known as Jewish.
Yeah, known as Jewish. Again, biblical things, but known as Jewish over time, just simply because of bad circumstances and bad blood on both sides of both Christianity and Judaism, because they both, fought against each other, especially in the beginning, in the first and second, third centuries. Matter of fact, much of what develops into Rabbinic Judaism develops the way it does in opposition to the followers of Yeshua.
Well, and what's interesting is if you look at 2nd, 3rd, 4th century Judaism and the development of Christianity, what you realize is that both developed in reaction and opposition to each other. The church was, well, we're not that, so we need to make sure we don't do that. And Judaism went, well, they're not us, so we want to make sure we don't do that. And it just continued from there. And truthfully, all the way through, even into the development of modern Judaism, That's been the reality. Is it's been reactionary primarily to Christianity, and Christianity vice versa. But I think it's interesting. Rabbi Jonathan brought up that there's the most believers instinctively keep the majority of the Torah, which I think is why Paul makes it a point to say those that do it from their heart without even realizing they're doing it are doing better than those that are trying to do it, but their heart's not right. And that's what he's getting at is and the reality is most of the church does. I would say that there's realistically three, like you said, but four things that are really the big debate that kind of differentiates between Messianic Judaism and the church in terms of practice, and that is, you already said the Shabbat and the Moedim, the appointed days, which realistically are one thing, but for the sake of discussion, we'll make them two, and then Kashrut, and then the fourth is actually physical circumcision. Right. And out of those physical circumcisions, the only one I give any credence to, and only because of the fact that it is specifically a covenantal sign to Abraham and his descendants. It's not to say Gentiles can't participate in it. It is obligatory specifically to Jews. It's not necessarily obligatory to Gentiles, but you come into this covenant within Messianic Judaism, you become really within the body of Messiah. You become a part of the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and so there can be an argument made for circumcision as such, not for the sake of conversion, but as an outward sign of what is happening inward.
Right.
And but I think one of the things that is kind of nuts, and I think we're probably in one way or another, we're probably all guilty of it at some point, whether we realize it or not. But I think one of the big things for me, I thought it was funny, Rabbi Eric said earlier before we started this, that it's funny that Messianic Judaism tends to be kind of anti or counter the church except for Gentiles. That it's fine if they're over there and we're over here, but then also likes to teach, well, the church does this wrong and this wrong and this wrong and what have you. And I think it's interesting for me that I've never met somebody who made a Messianic Jewish synagogue their home, like long-term, who made it their home, that God wasn't already working on their heart about the things that make Messianic Judaism unique from the rest of the body. And, so like, everybody that comes to CMC that comes out of the church comes because at some point they were reading their Bible and went, this Shabbat thing, that seems to still be important. And, Rosh Hashanah seems to still be important. And this Kashrut stuff and this, and they start to like the gears are turning because God's already doing something in their heart. And then they come to the synagogue and they plug in and they get involved, they get connected, and they're there for years because God was already working, right? But there's a lot of people in the church that are just as much a part of the body of Messiah as any of the four of us, as anyone in our congregations, as anyone within Messianic Judaism, as we are, who aren't in a place where God is either God's not working on their heart about it yet, or it's down the list of things he's got to work on before he gets to it. But that they're just not in the place to be there. But that doesn't make them any less a follower of Yeshua, and it doesn't make the church any less a part of the body of Messiah. And I think for whatever reason in Messianic Judaism, we have this notion that it's us versus them rather than, and by the way, we've said this in other episodes, we do this internally too, right? One organization against the other. It's us versus them. Right. But we do it on the greater scale as well, because we often look at it as Messianic Judaism versus the church. And when I get invited to go speak to a church, I don't go in there to try and fix what I think is wrong with them. I go to address the specific topic they asked me to address. And if questions come up, great, I'll try to answer them. But whether I'm dealing with a non-believing Jewish person or I'm dealing with a Gentile Christian who is just curious about Messianic Judaism, why we exist, what we do, who we are, I generally try to operate under the policy of I don't answer questions that aren't asked. Because if God's not already doing something there, then I'm jumping ahead of what he's trying to do.
Yeah, I wanted to share that while this is our opinion that we're sharing, it's not that this isn't a biblical opinion or that this isn't based strictly and directly on Scripture. When we look at Acts 10, which is where Cornelius and his household become believers, it starts out by saying that Cornelius was a devout man revering God with his household. He gave tzedakah generously to the people, and he prayed continually. And so, here's Cornelius, who appears to be a righteous Gentile. We don't know exactly what all he observed, didn't observe. We don't know how much of Judaism he followed. But what we do know is that when God gives Peter the vision about Cornelius, he shows him all sorts of four-footed animals, reptiles and birds of the air, and tells him, get up, Peter, kill and eat. So God could have just had kosher animals on that sheet and said, arise, slay, and eat. And if he was trying to say that Gentiles that were faithful like Cornelius were already kosher, they were already okay, but he has unclean and clean animals on the sheet, both. And then he tells Peter, slay and eat. Peter says, I've never eaten anything unclean. And then God says, don't call what I've made clean unclean. And so our conversation is that there may be some non-Jewish people who are Ger Tzedek. They are righteous Gentiles who have fully inserted themselves into biblical Judaism. They eat kosher, they keep Shabbat, they do all those things. But God isn't just saying that those that have already become kosher animals are now clean. He actually says those that aren't yet fully kosher, those what I've made clean, don't call unclean. And I believe that applies to those that are truly born again, that are within the greater body, that we need to understand that if God has seen fit to fill them with His Ruach HaKodesh, with His Holy Spirit, if they are truly born again, then we can't other them from the kingdom. We do have to teach them and instruct them, and that the Ruach was given to lead all men to truth. That the purpose of God's Spirit is to lead us and guide us into all truth. But that we should not other them as if they were an unclean beast, like that's the pig and we're the cow. But we should understand that all of us are a little pig. All of us have things that are unclean within us that God is teaching us and guiding us and drawing us closer into Him. And so we shouldn't other them as if that way. And I've actually heard leaders say things like, there's 1 million Jewish people in the churches, according to Barna. There's 1 million Jewish people that are believers in Yeshua that attend churches. And I've heard leaders saying every one of those 1 million people need to be in Messianic Judaism. But it's okay for all of the non-Jews to stay in the church. And I see that as errant in following what God said in Acts 10 through His word to us. We are one body. If all those 1 million Jews should be in Messianic Judaism, then we should be inviting all of those non-Jews to be part of the one body of Messiah, and to adopt a biblical lifestyle as God leads them to it through His Holy Spirit, not as we condemn them or try to convict them on our own or preach at them or any of those things. And I think it's important that we look at Acts 10 in light of the actual message of God, which was that those animals, the unclean animals that were on that sheet, were made clean. They didn't become clean animals. They were made clean by God. And Peter was told not to call them unclean, even in that. And I would say, you guys mentioned Shabbat, the Feast of Festivals, and Kashrut. I would say that the cleanliness ordinances of God are something that is also not taught, but is relevant, because in the scope of understanding clean and unclean, we understand what God has done to us by making the unclean clean. And that's a thing that we don't do enough teaching of, but we need to. Because in order to understand how somebody becomes born again, we have to understand the atonement of God and how God made us clean through the teachings and understandings of how the Torah works. Not that the Torah made us clean, but God made us clean, but He gave us the Torah so that we would understand how that happens.
So here's the question: how do we? And we can talk about this from Messianic Judaism, because realistically, we're all within the construct of Messianic Judaism. This is where we act, where we minister, what we know, and so the precipice of the discussion's upon us. And also, we're the newer brother on the block, so to speak, because though Messianic Judaism goes all the way back to the first century, the reality is what we know as Messianic Judaism is 100 years old, give or take. And so, in terms of the body of Messiah, we're the younger guy on the block, and so we should take that precipice of weight upon us. But how do we begin to change the attitude within Messianic Judaism toward the church, away from being an entirely negative attitude? Because honestly, most of my life in the movement, I've always witnessed and heard kind of a negative attitude toward the church. So how do we fix that? How do we begin to bring repair there, and restoration and relationship with our brothers and sisters in the church? And then also, how do we attempt to open dialogue with those in the church in a way that helps to foster not only the relationship, but a deeper understanding of the totality of the Word of God?
Yeah, how do we deal with that without being condescending, while at the same time not compromising the truths of God's Word?
I have some unhinged opinions about this very thing, not which I will share here for legal and personal reasons. But I think part of it is how we educate the people that come in our doors. And how we and we're pretty good about this, like getting our people away from certain things when they come into our doors, because there's a lot of very bad, if not, I won't directly call it evil teaching, but there's a lot of bad teaching out there in relation to what practices of the church are quote unquote pagan or not. And there's a lot of bad stuff out there, like a lot, that people can find within seconds of doing a Google search. So I think that's part of it, is you get a lot of people who get, particularly on the Gentile side, who come into Messianic Judaism. People will, get burnt by their church or ask questions that don't necessarily get answered. And so then they go looking themselves. And instead of having a guide along the way, they just kind of self-create an identity based on information they're finding on the internet, which is maybe good, maybe bad. But a lot of them develop this identity that everything the church done is pagan, all of it's wrong, all of it's bad, it's actually evil, and so we should have nothing to do with it, with those wicked pagans over there, which actually kind of ironically is kind of like not the Messianic position. Like, I mean, the whole point of the Messianic position was to be in and among the pagans, to tell them to repent and to come to God. So, that's they're wrong on that part too. But there's a lot of bad information out there that I think if we could, as a movement, because there's a lot of Messianic teachers that allow bad information to just kind of perpetuate, and rather than tackling it as a group, we just kind of allow things to, and I'm not speaking like of us four here, but us collectively as leaders and teachers, we have allowed bad information that is like demonstratively bad to fester. And all it does is it produces these very anti-church thoughts, the rhetoric, and creates people who it becomes this very issue we're dealing with here about this sort of triumphalistic idea of Messianic Judaism, despite the fact that we have a lot of issues, which we have discussed on this podcast. Like, we have a lot. So to take this triumphalistic view against the church because you heard, Joe YouTuber say that something the church did was pagan without verifying it through any reputable source at all. Just took it for what it was because you were angry at the church or your pastor or your mom or your dad or whatever, and ran with it. And now here you are sitting in a mire of very anti-church rhetoric and thought that's not has no merit, And so now we have to get out of that place and help bring if we can bring people out of that place, then we can begin to develop those relationships between Messianic Judaism and the church that are, we're part of the body, you're part of the body, we have something to bring to you, you have something to bring. Realistically, you have 1,800 years of teaching, tradition, and practice that we can look to and say, okay, there's been a continual thing here. The body of Messiah has lasted for 2,000 years, largely under the auspices of the church. Messianic Judaism, as we know it today, like David was saying, is less than 100 years old. Like we are reviving something that is being, that is ancient, but that has to be revived. It has to be brought back. And when you revive a person, when you bring someone back after they've drowned or have died, they've coded under a heart attack, you don't just you don't give them a bunch of stuff after you revive them. You don't give them a bunch of food. You don't give them a bunch of water. You definitely don't give them junk food. You definitely don't give them fast food, and candy bars and sodas. You give them like saline. Yeah, you give them liquids, and you let them rest and sit still and be quiet for a while before you kind of give them full run of the mill.
And the truth of the matter is, there should be an innate respect in Messianic Judaism for the greater body of Messiah, for the church, specifically because of the fact that there are very few Messianic rabbis, especially of my father's generation and before him, that did not come to faith in or through a church. The majority of them were, 10, 15 years or whatever in the church. Some of them were ordained in denominational traditions and then had an awakening to Messianic Judaism and returned to Judaism and started Messianic synagogues, some of whom are still deeply connected with denominational churches, denominational traditions that they were a part of before. And so the reality is, again, Messianic Judaism, as we know it today, would not exist if it were not for the church. And though, yes, we have things that we're not happy with or satisfied with the church, and truthfully, the church does with us as well. We have our own problems too. The reality is that we are a lot more similar than we are different. We're a part of the same body. It shouldn't be an us versus them. Now, there are aspects of the church that, there are problems, not just problems.
Yes.
But aside from that, the church as a whole, like we're supposed to be working together, not against each other. We should be able to celebrate each other's victories, not try and tear them down because it didn't happen in our world or whatever.
Yeah, we talk about the Messianic movement being a restorative movement and restoring the tabernacle of David and all that. But when you restore something, like if you go out into a barn and you find an old Model A car there or a Model T car, you don't restore it by throwing everything away and just starting over. You restore it by cutting away rust and things like that, and then by adding to and replacing and fixing and correcting and painting and doing all the things that are done. So when we're dealing with this, God used the church, and through it, he brought forth Messianic Judaism. And if Messianic Judaism is a restorative move of God within the body of Messiah, then it's not our job to get rid of the church. It's our job to work to restore it to what it should be. And that has to be done in love. And you're not going to do that by chopping off entire sections and tossing it in the garbage. We're going to have to, with effort, with time, with work. It takes a lot of work to restore something. It's not something you do overnight. And we need to look at that in that way and really understand. Now, that doesn't mean, and I've said this several times, it doesn't mean compromise. I'm not talking about pretending that anything the church does that's not biblical is acceptable, or that we should accept things like gay marriage or abortion or whatever because it's accepted in portions of the greater body. I'm talking about in biblical truth, we take and work with those people to lead them and guide them. Aquila and Priscilla, we want to show you a more excellent way. We want to show you more of what God has for you, without othering them to a place where they're totally separate from us, nor by rejecting the majority of believers and only welcoming Jewish believers into our fold.
I just want to say, as someone who grew up in the church, the first 25 years of my life was where I was at in the Baptist church. I can tell you that the church does not talk about Messianic Judaism like Messianic Judaism in some congregations talks about the church. I mean, I was at a Messianic congregation for a number of years. The first one I attended, and there would be periods of time when the leader would rail against the church, would spend a lot of time doing that, especially around Easter and Christmas seasons. Eventually they stopped doing that because I think they realized what was happening. They were creating these disciples that were angry at everything outside of Messianic Judaism.
Right.
Wanting to, essentially, string people up who are wearing a Christmas sweater, right? Now listen, I do think it's not very tactful to enter, if say it's December or whatever, to come into a Messianic synagogue wearing a bunch of Christmas stuff. I do think that is
just out of place.
It is. It's really out of place. It no more than me going into a church on Sunday around Christmas time wearing decked out in a bunch of Jewish stuff, to try to make some kind of statement or whatever. I think that that's wrong. But I'm simply saying that in 25 years of growing up in the church, I visited a Messianic synagogue because I was in a place where I wasn't going to church anymore, and my dad had visited and said it was like a really awesome experience, and he really just felt a lot of God there. And he said, if you're looking for a place, just give this a shot. You don't have to be Jewish to go. So I went there, and it was, of course it changed my life. But what I'm saying is that if I could compare, though, now 20 years into Messianic Judaism versus 25 years in the church just talks about Jesus. I mean, that's what they do. They don't talk about Messianic Judaism. They don't talk about that. I think for some people, it's just not even on their radar.
Yeah.
And I think for some churches, maybe they know about Messianic Judaism, and clearly, you have like Gateway, and you have like a couple of like Celebration, these churches that we know that actually make room for Messianic Judaism. But
right.
You have some churches I know that listen, I met Chris Tomlin, the worship leader, who wrote like How Great Is Our God and stuff. If you're a Christian, or even if you're Messianic, you know who Chris Tomlin is, because Joshua Aaron covered How Great Is Our God and did it in Hebrew. And when I met him, he asked me what church I went to. And I said, I attend a Messianic synagogue. And he went, what is that? So what I'm saying is you have massive swaths of Christianity that are incredibly influential that don't even know what it is.
Right.
And we're not. So what I'm telling you is that I think it's important as someone who's been to the church to let the greater Messianic movement know that they don't talk about you, not like you talk about them. So that needs to stop, in the sense that
they don't find us as threatening as we think they do.
No, because they're worried, because their just thing is the gospel, and it's all about Jesus, and and that's not a bad thing. I'm just saying that I think it's important even to understand for Gentiles that come out of the church and are called into Messianic Judaism, they should know. They need to understand that it's not like the pastor, I need to put a sermon together about how we need to avoid Messianic Judaism because it's legalism. The way I know some Messianic rabbis say we need to talk about Christmas and Easter and these church
right.
things.
Well,
right.
I will say that there was, believe it or not, a mega congregation in our city where the pastor did spend a sermon talking about specifically our congregation and how we were legalist. I then made a phone call and said, hey, let's have coffee. And we had coffee. We talked. I expressed that where he was wrong in what he said about our congregation. We began a good relationship, and just last week his congregation gave our congregation a 15-passenger van because we went and talked about it. It wasn't...
Right.
He was misinformed about what we believed and how we believed it. We sat down and talked. But I was thinking about back to Cornelius and Peter. Peter, I understand that within Messianic Judaism there are a lot of people, because I was one of them, that found out everything I'd been taught, or at least a big part of it, was wrong. That I felt like I'd been lied to and deceived. Now I found truth, and I wanted everybody else to know truth also. And I imagine Peter, because Peter was raised in Temple Judaism, who didn't believe in the Messiah in the way that Yeshua came, who realized Yeshua is the Messiah, came to faith, and now he's being told to go preach to Cornelius. And I can't imagine him going to that household and saying, "You're all a bunch of pagans, and let me tell you what's wrong with paganism." I think what he shared was, I was wrong, and I found the Messiah, and you can also. And it's a different mindset, but I understand, because I was there, this anger, this frustration, this feeling of being lied to and deceived that drives people to want to tell people all of the wrong that they're doing. And I'm not against teaching people where they're wrong, but somewhere you could tell somebody that Halloween is pagan and that they shouldn't be a part of that, and that they're all going to go to hell for celebrating Samhain and all that. Or you can tell somebody that I was an alcoholic, that Yeshua touched my life and took away my alcoholism and made me free, and in that I have this newfound love for God and for His Word, and I'd like to share that with you, which will eventually lead them to see what in their life needed to be changed or adjusted. But I just cannot imagine that Peter stood up in Cornelius' household and just started rattling off all of the pagan things that pagans and Romans did. I think he shared Yeshua and Him crucified and resurrected with Him, and then allowed that to become something in his life. And Toby, you're right. I've other than that one pastor who personally attacked our congregation and we restored, I've been in hundreds and hundreds of churches and never had one that spent their whole message telling what was wrong with Messianic Judaism, or for that matter, even Judaism. Aside, they and we need to understand that yes, we need to teach truth, and yes, we need to tell people about the feasts and the festivals, and yes, Shabbat is Saturday and not Sunday, and yes, these are things that God taught and expects us to abide by in our life and walk out in our faith, but there has to be an understanding that these are clean people.
Yes.
That God has made clean, that we're instructing in more depth and more righteousness, and we need to listen to them, because it just may be that they can instruct us in some righteousness and holiness in our lives that would also strengthen us.
And I've said it before, I'll say it time and time again. I think there's going to be a lot of people that are going to get to heaven and be really upset because they see somebody that they assumed weren't going to be in heaven. Bob the Baptist is going to see some Methodist, and no, they weren't that shouldn't be. The Pentecostal's going to see the Catholic. No, they aren't supposed to. This was our. And I think there's a lot of Messianics that are going to be really ticked off when they get there and see other, the people from the church that are there. And
the Catholics made it here too.
And obviously, you're not really going to be ticked off. But I think that's the reality we operate with here and now is we're like, they're not good enough. They're not. But that's just not the case. Either Messiah's blood was enough or it wasn't. Right? And that doesn't mean that just because it was enough that we can't walk in a deeper relationship with His Word. But it also doesn't mean that because somebody's not walking in the same deeper relationship with His Word that they don't also know His blood.
And I want to make sure that our listeners listen to what was just said and don't add to it. We did not just say that all Catholics were going to heaven, or all Methodists were going to heaven, or all Baptists were going to heaven, or all Messianics were going to heaven.
But we also didn't say that not all of them will.
We didn't say that. But what we are saying is that God, when you look at our congregation, and I've done this before, I've sat in our congregation and said, if you were something else before you got here, raise your hand. Okay, how many people used to be Baptists? How many people used to be traditional Jews in a Reform or Conservative or Orthodox? How many were Methodist? How many were Catholic? How many were... Our congregation is filled with people that used to be something else. And I love the verse that says, such were some of you, but you're now something else. I think heaven is going to be filled with used-to-bes. Mm-hmm. I don't think there's going to be Messianics in heaven. I think there's going to be former Messianics. I think we're going to understand the unity of the body of Messiah and drop off all of the other things without compromise, I'm not justifying sin or calling sin righteousness or anything like that. But I think that God has each of us walking a journey toward Messiah, and all those that get there are going to be with him regardless of where they started or how many leaps they went. You know, the space movies where they do these jumps from one place to another. People, I started in Orthodox Judaism and then Conservative Judaism and then went to a Pentecostal church and then came to Messianic Judaism. I jumped each of those jumps, and I know people that have jumped 15 or 20 times as God led them into more truth.
Right.
And they're former this, and they're now where they are.
Yeah.
And I'm where I am because I think it's the closest thing to truth right now. But as God leads me along, in a year, I hope I'm not exactly who I am now. I hope that I've grown and become closer to Him. And so it's just important that we don't look at others as unclean or unrighteous,
right,
or unapart of God's kingdom, right, because of where they are right now.
Yeah.
And we also need to understand that the kingdom is made up of Jew and non-Jew, and we shouldn't shift 75% of the body of Messiah outside the scope of where it is and then leave them there as if it's okay for there to be two complete separate bodies of Messiah. The Bible says there's one body.
Yeah.
Yeah, because sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, because like it or not, God pulls people out of desperate sin into the church constantly.
Yep.
All the time. And, my family had, that's where my grandfather was a bootlegger in, the Appalachian areas. I mean, for all intents and purposes, he was a gangster in South Carolina and, ran alcohol and was into all sorts of
ran that 20-something slug life.
Yeah, he was not in a good way. And, when he became a Christian, radical change. And the entire community saw it. They all knew he was up to no good. But then when he, and became a Southern Baptist. And so, you can't tell me that God can't work with Southern Baptists.
Rabbi Jonathan Burness
went from bootlegging to Southern Baptist.
I know, it's a stark, it's like...
that's the pendulum.
And this is 1930s, 40s Southern Baptist, where it was alcohol was a big no-no.
Rabbi Jonathan Burness, if you listen to his testimony, was a drug dealer.
Yeah.
Who ended up leading...
He was a wholesaler.
he was an unregistered pharmaceutical distributor. But he led hundreds of thousands of people, or through his ministry, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people to Messiah,
right,
both Jew and non-Jew. And so we need to be really careful in how we do and what we do because, and again, as Rabbi David said earlier, I was led to Messiah by a Christian. I wasn't led to Messiah by a Messianic Jew. Now, there's more Messianic Jews now, so more Jewish people are being led to Messiah. But had it not been for a Christian, I wouldn't be a Messianic Jew.
And still statistically, more Jews come to faith in Messiah through Christians and the church than they do Messianic Judaism.
And here's, I think, the most important question to wrestle with in this conversation, and that is, whose kingdom exactly is it that we're building? Is it a Messianic Jewish kingdom? Is it a Southern Baptist kingdom? Is it Assemblies of God kingdom? Is it a Methodist, global Methodist kingdom? Is it what is it? And if the answer is Messiah's kingdom, then those that are working toward his kingdom should work together as one, and not fight against each other as though we are somehow superior because we know different or believe different or whatever.
Right.
That's not to say that you don't have your own convictions, right? That's not to say that you don't live according to the conviction of the word in your heart. But you don't tear down the work of Messiah in somebody else's life or in somebody else's ministry just because it doesn't look exactly like yours.
Right. It's kind of like a track team. Like, you all show up to the track wearing the same color jersey. You all come from the same place. All are ultimately headed back to the same place after the track meet. But you all are doing different things.
Events.
You all are you're sprinting a short distance race. You're running a long distance race. You're throwing a javelin, throwing a discus.
Jumping over stuff.
Right.
Yep. And so, ultimately it boils down to Paul's discussion of the body, right? Some are, the arms, some are the legs, some are the eyes, some are the ears, some are the, we can't all be everything. We have our place, but the body has to work together as one.
Right. And like a sports team, there are some team members who are in better shape than others. And it may just be that the Messianic movement is in better shape in regards to some of biblical truth than others, but it doesn't mean we aren't competing towards the same trophy.
Yeah, and I would venture to say that just because we think we're in better shape doesn't mean that we're truly walking in the fruit of the Spirit at all times.
Right.
Because I think the root of this conversation, in this episode in particular, is that sometimes the fruit of the Spirit's not seen through Messianic Judaism and or the church in the way it should be seen. And I think a lot of the disunity and division we see has more to do with a lack of the fruit of the Spirit than it does with the work of Messiah in and of itself in our lives. And with that, we will chat with you guys later. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to the MessianTics podcast. Make sure to subscribe so you can be notified every time we drop a new episode. And be sure to follow and interact with us on social media at MessianTics Podcast.